Hello everyone. I think we're ready to go. We've still got a few people to come tonight, but we will make a start. My name's Sue Lawson, and on behalf of the Geelong Regional Library Corporation, I'd like to welcome you to the library's virtual author event. Normally we're all there together, but today, of course, we're in our homes, still in lockdown. Before we start, the Geelong Regional Library Corporation would like to acknowledge the Wadawurrung and the Eastern Maar original owners of the lands on which the library services are based, and we pay our respects to the Wadawurrung and Eastern Maar elders past, present and future. We also acknowledge and celebrate First Nation people of this land as the custodians of learning, literacy, knowledge and story. Well, welcome to everyone tonight. We're expecting around 200 people to join us. I was going to make yo-yos, but figured, it'd be a bit hard with so many of us. Now, before we start, I do have a little bit of housekeeping for you. I've got it on the screen to remind me in case you're wondering where I'm looking. First of all, please participate. You'll see down the bottom, if you use your mouse, you'll see there's a Q&A section or on my screen it's to the right. That's where you can write your questions for Tom. So please pop your questions in whenever you're ready. We'll almost go to them straight away as soon as they appear. So please feel free to do that. Now, the other thing is if you're using your iPhone or iPad, you will need to move that around a little bit. So hopefully that all makes sense to you. This is Tom and my first time doing this, so strap yourselves in, I say. So tonight I have the very great pleasure of introducing one of Australia's most loved and prolific authors. Really, I don't need to introduce him, but I will. Tom Keneally is an award-winning author who writes novels and non-fiction, and he also writes plays and children's books. He's quite an underachiever. His novels include The Chant of Jimmy Blacksmith, Schindler's Ark, which of course was turned into that moving, incredible film Schindler's List, and also The People's Train. He's won the Miles Franklin, the Booker, the Los Angeles Times Prize, the Mondello and International Prize, which is quite a feat. He's also been made a literary lion, I want to know what that means, of the New York Public Library, a fellow of the American Academy, recipient of the University of California Gold Medal, and is now on a stamp, a 55-cent stamp. Welcome, Tom. It's lovely to have you with us.
Thank you.
That's quite a list. Do you ever listen to that and go, God, have I done all that?
Yes, it's a bit improbable. I'm a yobbo from Homebush via the Macleay Valley in northern New South Wales. And it's I certainly don't take it seriously. And I'm pleased to see my grandkids don't take my writing too seriously either. One of them said to me, "Why do people we don't know call you Tom?" And then after a pause, before I could answer, she said, "Oh, I know, it's probably those books you write." And so...
What about your kids? Were they, when they were younger, did they ever read your book when they were still living at home? Did they read your books and comment on them?
Well, it's certainly they've read my books as adults, yeah, and commented on them. And that's a bit embarrassing because you don't write your books for your kids. You don't write them for your mother. You don't write them really for anyone who's close to you. You write them for strangers. They're a love letter to strangers. And so it's a little bit discombobulating when your children say they've read your books. But my daughter Meg, who's a novelist herself, is well up on all my books. So the good and the bad, the indifferent, and I mean, I suppose if you write a book, you have to face up to everyone.
Exactly. And it's easy to face up to strangers, I think. Now, on the topic of books, of course, we've got lots to talk about, but we are actually here to talk about your new one. Congratulations, The Dickens Boy. I absolutely loved it, and that's why I'm glad we're talking about Meg early, because obviously it's about Nick Dickens' sons. Would you like to give us a brief description of how you would describe the book?
Well, it is an attempt to partly to tell the story of Dickens' youngest child in Australia, a boy called Plawn, who was only 16 when he arrives in Melbourne. And it's also a bit of a love letter to Dickens, flaws and all. And on top of that, it's a story about how we're always trying to please a parent. I know that both my parents, I've been trying to please, and they are deceased now, but I'm still trying to please them. I'm still trying to stand up for them and get them to say, what a clever boy. Which sadly they never will again, but you never escape your parents because they are the gods of your childhood. They are the people who aren't supposed to die because they are gods, and then they do, which is astonishing and which takes your breath away and disorients you. But the fact they're gone doesn't diminish their power over you in the least. And young Dickens had a profound desire to satisfy his father, given that his father, given that he was rather dyslexic, bad at school, and his father wanted him to apply himself. And as Dickens himself said, find your groove, which is sounds a very 20th century objective. And in the hope that he would apply himself and find his groove, he sent him to Australia.
I loved Plawn. I absolutely loved him. Would you like to tell us, I'm not even going to try and say it, what was his full nickname? Because his real name is Edward and he got Plawn, but what did Dickens call him?
Dickens was a likable, sportive sort of fella. He did terrible things in his marriage and all the rest of it, but in any case, he nicknamed his youngest child Plawnish Maruntagunta, and that was reduced to Plawn, and everyone called him Plawn based on that ridiculous nickname, Plawnish Maruntagunta. His real name was Edward Bulwer Lytton and Dickens. And Edward Bulwer Lytton was a famous novelist and a famous politician in the 19th century. Had affairs with Disraeli, was Secretary of State for the Colonies. And his wife wrote a letter to the Prime Minister, Lord Derby, saying he shouldn't be Secretary of State for the Colonies. He should be sent to the colonies. And that was, there was another son in Australia when Plawn arrived, and his name was Alfred Tennyson Dickens. His godfather was Alfred Tennyson himself. And so they had distinguished godparents, these two boys, who had rather, like most of the Dickens boys, had rather puzzled Dickens by not having academic aptitude. And indeed, it was obvious that Plawn was at least dyslexic, if he didn't have other learning difficulties, had difficulties with text, and had read none of his father's work. Every colonial he met
was palpable, yeah, just his fear.
Every colonial he meets expect him to be totally read up on his father's work and informed about it. And that is Paul Plawn's dilemma.
And then even one of the First Nations people, I think it was Culte, one of them actually knew of Dickens as well. The poor thing, he was just, it's everywhere.
Yes,
it's absolutely everywhere.
Aboriginal. But as well as that, in the 19th century, people were able to recite Dickens as a party trick, you know. You might sing a Scottish ballad, a Robbie Burns song, you might play the piano, But if you could recite a whole scene from Dickens, that was brought the house down. And poor Plawn meets even a bushranger who recites, who takes a whole remote station captive and entertains them with a recital of a scene, the breach of promise court scene from Pickwick Papers. And so there's a bushranger who can do the Dickens trick, which Plawn himself can't.
Tell me, why Plawn? Why not Alfred? Like, you had the choice of two boys over here in Australia.
Yes, I think it was the youth of Plawn. He arrived when he was 16. Now, other sons of Dickens, he tried things with, for example, with Alfred Tennyson Dickens to get him a job in a China house, that is an exporting house to China. But that didn't quite work. They tried to get him a job in foreign affairs or the Foreign Office. And he failed the entry examination for that, Alfred Dickens did. With the youngest, Dickens didn't try too hard. He decided that Plawn was pretty much a lost case academically. There's a letter that he writes to one of Plawn's teachers saying, forget the Latin grammar and forget the geometry and the chemistry. Just let all that go, because he won't need it in the rough colonial life he's about to face. But Plawn is, for me, an incarnation of all those unsatisfactory sons of the gentry who were sent to Australia. I mean, first of all, we had the convicts, and then very quickly, the Brits decide that if you have an unsatisfactory son, send him to Australia. That will somehow redeem him. And you see that happen even in Dickens' own work, above all in David Copperfield, where he sends both a working class earnest family, a fallen girl called Little Emily. It was a place where fallen girls could make their, girls who'd gone into prostitution could redeem themselves. And Mr. Micawber, the most useless of characters, the habitual debtor, becomes a magistrate in Australia. And so this curious feeling that Dickens had and other people had, that Australia was the redemption for the unsatisfactory son of the gentry. And it's there in a number of works of Victorian and late Victorian literature. In The Importance of Being Earnest, you have Jack saying to Algernon, who's a wastrel, he says, your uncle said at dinner last night that your situation is such you must choose between this world, the next world, and Australia. And
I was only threatened with boarding school.
Oh, yeah.
So we've actually got a couple of questions, so we might go to them.
Yes,
we'll go back and forth.
Yeah.
We'll go to one from Catherine first. First of all, she says, thank you for your fabulous book. So we love Catherine already. Can you comment on the difference in writing collaboratively with your daughter Meg compared to writing on your own?
Oh, yes, it's all up to me on my own. I am expert in using my daughter to do the hard work. And particularly since my agent decided that we would work out the plot together, Meg would do the first draft, and then we'd write it together. That's the way those Montserrat, the novels about the gentleman convict who is a detective, have been going. And yes, I have to try. What I notice about Meg when she writes her first draft, and we consult every day, is that she has good narrative pace. She really gets the story galloping along. more than her dowdy old geriatric father ever does. And so we learn from each other as we rewrite the Montserrat novels. But yes, here in the case of the Dickens Boy, you have to find the plot yourself. You have to work out the resolutions yourself. You have to work out the dynamism between characters yourself. You have to, and I don't like that as much as exploiting my daughter.
Especially as you're making her do the hard part. The first draft's awful to do.
Yes, the first draft is the hard draft.
Oh, it's horrible.
And we do it together in the sense that she consults basically daily with me. Yeah. And then we take it from there. But we're going to write another one next year.
Well, this leads me to Ken's question, because Ken, and I read this the other day too, that there were 12 books to come. Where are you at? What number are you up to?
We're going into book 5, and it's going to involve a very interesting convict station that Governor Darling created at a place out near Dubbo, and it was for gentlemen convicts. It was specially founded that gentlemen convicts wouldn't escape harsh punishment. And that's where the next book is going to be, and it has a serial killer, very glamorous, very cool.
Oh, yes. Look forward to that one.
And that will ultimately be out, and sooner rather than later.
Oh, good. And do you think you'll get to 12? You're not going to run out of steam with ideas before 12?
No, well, I'm hoping to live long enough for the 12, but it's easy to last because there are so many strange convict stations around the sphere. There was the one for gentlemen at Wellington, which the other convicts called the Valley of the Swells. But then down in Tasmania, there are places like Point Pua. There's Hunter Valley, the coal mines, convict coal mines in the Sydney region. And so we're not going to run out of convict stations. I think I'm going to run out of life before we run out of convict stations.
I doubt it. Not if she's keeping a cracking pace. You'll be right. On the historical thing, how liberal are you with facts? Because, I mean, we have to make, when we're writers, we have to make it fit a narrative. So how do you cope with that?
Well, look, it's amazing how often facts suit the story. A few years ago, I wrote a novel about Napoleon on the island he died on, St. Helena. And the family out there were ultimately sent that were close to him. The British family, his providores, the father supplied groceries to the Napoleon's house. They were allowed to approach him without any debriefing, without any permission, etc., etc. And the question is why? And I think one of them had to be a spy, unwillingly, but someone would have, the governor would have told one of them, the wife, the husband, the daughter, would have said, if you want to stay and you're making a good living out of all this because you're supplying the entire British fleet, the British garrison, and Napoleon, and you can bowl up to Napoleon's place anytime you like, I think one of them had to be a spy. And similarly, in the Dickens book, we don't know how the Dickens boys found out about the death of their father in 1870. Now, Dickens was overworking like crazy. He'd split with his wife. The kids knew all about that. They had mixed feelings about it, as kids will. He was working himself to death, sustaining his family, his wife and his mistress, Ellen Ternan, and her family, and as well as the boys in far places. And so he dies, drops dead in his house in Gad's Hill in Kent, in his dining room. He's put on a settee, a sofa, and he dies the next day of a stroke. Now, we don't know how the boys found out about this. First, it was rumors. Then it was reports from the press in Calcutta, but there was no overland telegraph, as you know. It didn't come in to start to service Australia till 1872. And so it was months, given the distance that they were from Sydney, given that they were out beyond the Darling River, near the South Australian border. It was months before they were found out definitively and unarguably that their illustrious father was dead. And so I felt free to mess about with that and to, to make up details about how they would have heard of that. They don't mention in their letters or journals how they heard about it. And so there's an area that a fiction writer can use, the way I use the idea that one of them had to be an agent on St. Helena, one of that family. Similarly, the rumor of death, the arrival of the first unreliable reports of Dickens's death, then the appearance of the report in the Sydney Morning Herald and the Age, but those newspapers had a long way to go before they reached the backcountry beyond Wilcannia. And
it's a very powerful scene.
The whole question of how they got the news is inevitably a torment to them. They got the news and they didn't believe it. Then they got it again and they didn't believe it. Then they got it again. And then they got the letters from home, which made it final for them. And again, those letters are months old and they're brought by wagon from Cobar to Wilcannia and from there into the Mulga, because both men were out beyond Wilcannia. And so they were about the last people, they were probably amongst the last people in Australia who got definitive news of their father's death. They're also the only two people in Australia who could discuss their father, warts and all. The way siblings are. They are, you might have a father who is idealized by those who knew him, but no one is uniformly ideal.
No, and even
in a long family life.
And even with Alfred and Plorn, they had differing views, and Plorn really struggled with that, didn't he? When Alfred would try and express how he felt, he'd get a bit stopped.
Well, it's the question of Australia and who their father sends to Australia. Dickens had a house in Shepherd's Bush, which was bought by Baroness Coutts of Coutts Bank, the inheritor of Coutts Bank. She had bought it, and into it Dickens admitted, under the care of a committee of women, unfortunate girls. Some of them were prostitutes, but some of them were girls who'd finished in the ragged schools and had nowhere to go. Others were seamstresses that had been sacked by their bosses. Others were girls from the workhouse, the worst and most, relentlessly grinding of institutions. Girls from the workhouse who'd been tossed out of the workhouse. Rebellious girls, and Dickens liked rebellious girls. And so he put these women into a house at Shepherd's Bush called Urania Cottage. And if they did well for a year, he sent them to the colonies. He and the committee sent them to the colonies. Most of them came to Australia, most of the girls who lasted. He wrote about them in his journal, Household Words, and indeed in Household Words, and to only a slightly lesser degree in his next journal, All the Year Round, he writes about Australia. He's got this view of Australia that it redeems people. It saves people from themselves. And he sends Micawber to Australia, and he sends the Peggies to Australia, as I said, and he sends Magwitch to Australia. Magwitch is an Australian convict who is a grandee in Australia. Only problem is, because of his initial crimes, is not allowed to return to the UK without risking death. And here's the man who leaves a fortune to Pip. The idea is any mug can make it in Australia, basically. And so he sends his mug sons to Australia, but they're always, individuals are always more than that. And I quite like them. Alfred Tennyson Dickens is an amiable fellow, but Plorn in particular, with his questing, with his desire to satisfy his father, he is one that I love. And Plorn in particular has a remarkable boss, a man called Fred Bonney.
He was
who is
amazing.
a photographer. This man existed. He was a wet plate photographer 100 kilometers out beyond Wilcannia in the 19th century, in the 1860s, 1870s. He took pictures of the Parkinshee people, the people of the river. He took pictures. There's one of his pictures that astonishes me. It's a huge sea of wool that is running down a creek on the property, and they've washed the grease out of the wool because they can't afford to export the grease. And this sea of wool will ultimately be put upon wagons, sent to Hobart, then to Sydney, and then it will end up in the textile factories of the UK.
I had no idea that happened. That was amazing.
And so he's a remarkable, as well as that, Fred Bonney knows the Aboriginals very well. And he tries to keep the mounted police of every persuasion, South Australian, Queensland, and New South Wales, off his property. And the Queensland mounted police often comes down chasing Aboriginals who are suspected of crimes in Queensland, chasing them onto Mamba. And if he can, he orders them off, reminding them they have no jurisdiction. And so
I thought, as I was reading, I thought, oh, you know, the massacre side of things is in the background, and then, oh, you got me. I thought we'd sort of just skipped around it. I'm trying not to give it away to people who haven't read it.
Yes, there's a terrible massacre towards the end of a group of Aboriginals who haven't come in. And that was typical of when young Plorn arrived here. There were Aboriginals who had settled at the station. There were Aboriginals who closer in had gone into reservations. But there were others who were purists and who said, no, we won't go for that tobacco, for that flour, for that sugar, for that tea. We will stand aside. And they were in a very difficult position. And their story is told in this book also. There's everything from the mythology of the Parkinshee to the minutiae of Dickens's plots. And it's all...
No, go on, you keep going. I'm going to bring you the question.
It's all alive to these two boys.
Yeah. Oh, look, it's amazing. We'll go to some questions. If you do have questions, just to remind you, at the bottom of the screen, mine's on the right, I'm not sure where yours is, you'll see a little box Q&A. And if you have questions, please type them in there. We've got a couple here, one from Catherine, She wants to know, is there a pattern to where you find inspiration for your books?
Is there a pattern?
Mm.
Often hapless people who are given a bigger task than they can deal with. Yes, that's a question from Catherine Jarstad. And that's purely, Catherine, because I'm a bit of incompetent, and I feel the world is too much for me too. So that's a continuum in what I write. And Ken Sampson asks, have you read any crits of your latest book? The one crit I had a glimpse of was critical, saying you stretched the facts. Well, that is the truth. I certainly, where the facts were missing, I wasn't slow to supply them. He says, sorry, I can't find the crit now. I think, and we ought to avoid it. Thank you.
I think we should. And I think too, Tom, that's why you said, you know, because we are writing fiction, but we're using historical things, we do need to play around with it. We can't, otherwise it'd be non-fiction if we were writing everything.
Indeed, yes. Fiction is lies.
Exactly.
And
I'm not sure whether that's Alison or Aliso, but do you seek out things, topics to write about, or does the idea just intrigue you to the point where you feel you have to write about it?
Yes, it's generally someone standing up against a big mechanism, whether it's Schindler, whether it's the disappointed Aboriginal Jimmy Blacksmith, whether it's the Australian in my book on East Africa, Tuas Mara, whether it's the girl, the teenage girl who ends up in Australia, but who lived in the same establishment as Napoleon when she was which the book about Napoleon's last time.
Even Plorn, though, he's up against it. He's up against the mythology of his dad, like the, you know, that whole.
Yes.
He's
Everyone
absolutely
who
up
meets
against
him
it.
thinks he'll be like his father. And even when he goes out to a paddock to meet the men, the hut keepers who live in remote paddocks, in paddocks 30 or 40 miles wide, he feels, you know, like saying, but I'm just me. He says to one person, I had no part in my birth. And Kate Dunn asked, do you want to give a new perspective of our history? Yes, I think our history, Kate, is fascinating, our social history, the people in it, the people who, for example, the hut keepers out in those remote huts, former convicts, former soldiers of the Crimean War, fascinating people. As people, in terms of people, our history is richly alive, and I want to celebrate that. I've never felt that we were deprived, that Australians, even though I've written about stories from elsewhere as well, I've never felt that Australian history was lacking in graphic stories. And I hope that this book proves that further.
Oh, I think it does. I think just something you said then reminded me of Plorn and his very first assignment where he was placed. That boy's courage when he walked out of there. It's right at the start of the book, so I'm not doing any spoilers for anyone who hasn't read it. But I just love that this English boy went off on his horse. I'm not putting up with that. Come off.
Yes, because there was a scandal in the Dickens family, and the boys, the two boys, are the only two in Australia who can talk about it. Nearby, well, in terms of Western New South Wales, nearby, was the son of Anthony Trollope, Fred Trollope, whom they meet during this book. And these are the only three men in the whole of Australia who can talk about what their fathers are really like, because the colonists only want to hear the good stories. They only want to hear that Dickens is Father Christmas, that Dickens is the secular saint of Christmas. And so I'm getting addicted to these questions, Sue. I've got the way they appear on the screen here. How kinky is this? That you can discourse with people in Geelong. And as well as the questions, we have your handsome visage there in the screen as well.
Well, I've actually put the questions over my face, Tom. I think that's the best place to put them. Now,
Rebecca, sorry.
No, I was going to say, Tom wants to know what your writing routine is. I'm particularly interested in this because you had an article in The Age, I think it was on the weekend anyway, about COVID and how writers have got their A, B and C to get going. What are your A, B and C? What do you do to get going?
Well, you see, we've got to start writing every time against the blank page. And the problem is, who am I to decide I'm going to write a novel? Gods write novels. Hunters like me, knuckle draggers like me, from Homebush, New South Wales, via the Macleay Valley, who are we to write novels? The point is that we have to con ourselves into it. We have to fool ourselves into beginning work every day. So, you know, I'm very likely to look at the jigs. I'm a jigsaw fiend. I do jigsaws online. And I'll do a bit of jigsaw. I'll do a bit of looking at the easier clues in the crossword, and then hit the writing. And once you start writing each day, you're okay, once you're into it.
It's tricking yourself, isn't it? It's almost coming up behind yourself and go, I'm in.
And even though I know that the only answer to not being able to write is to continue writing, even though I know that, even if I'm writing badly, continue writing in the subject, spend time in the presence of your book when you're feeling lousy about it. Now, of course, we go on a lot at literary festivals about feeling lousy about our book, but in fact, we love writing. On a good day, it gives us the greatest high you can get without drugs. Well, one of the two greatest highs, perhaps, says the old man, in remembrance of times past.
There are some days you feel like you could hold your hands over the keys and the words would just drip out. There are some days.
Yes, indeed. And you don't necessarily write as well then as you do when you're in agony. But nonetheless, it is the transcendence, the feeling that the book is bigger than you. That it's full of powers beyond your powers. That feeling is fantastic, and nothing can beat it.
When do you know you're done? When do you know, okay, that's it, I've finished this book?
Yes. I think the instincts of abandonment, books are not finished, they are abandoned, says someone.
I like that.
I think the point you jump out of the plane is a very valid, I mean, you've been in the story and you have been invested in it and you are getting your spiritual sustenance out of it, so that when you bail, you probably bail for good reasons. You know, novels are not finished, they're abandoned. A novel is a fiction of uncertain length with something wrong with it. And all these are true. But yes, I just used my next book, I bailed out at a particular point in a trial of the central character. And the trial hasn't been settled yet, but I just felt that was the time to leave him. That was the time to leave him. It's instinctual rather than an act of great reason.
Are you a planner, Tom? Are you how people say there are planners and pantsers, people who write by the seat of their pants, and there are planners. How would you describe yourself?
I'm seat of the pants for the first draft. I sort of know where we're going, but I have no control. I am controlled by the development of the manuscript. And thank God your subconscious begins to kick in and supply material to you. More so there was a Irish writer called Frank O'Connor, great short story writer. He said, I've got to write the first draft to know what the bloody thing's about. And I feel very much that. And a lot of writers are like that. They have to hack out the first draft. And at that stage, they don't feel in command at all. They feel dominated by the material. And then they go back and start. By the end of the first draft, you're beginning to know people. You go back and wonderful stuff starts to happen. Connections between characters, even connections you didn't see between events. The wonderful thing about your subconscious, which is very much involved in writing, because writing is a kind of dreaming, is that it works 24/7. It doesn't clock off when you clock off with your conscious mind and say, thank God, now I can have a Chardonnay. It doesn't clock off then. It goes on working and it goes on supplying. I'm a great believer in the unconscious, the subconscious, or the collective unconscious in writing. Whatever we got, that's all supplying us. The stuff from which the names of actors who were in that film in 1994, the difficult crossword clues that suddenly come to us, they come to us from that place, the eureka moment. And that's the place that's very involved in novel writing. So the answer is only begin, because that part of your soul, the part of your soul that where you know things you don't know you know, where you are connected with the imagination of every other human, that can only be activated by writing. And that's why writing badly is better than not writing at all.
Exactly. If you've got nothing, at least you've got something to edit, even if it's bad.
Yes.
Let's go back to these questions. Catherine has asked, have you ever thought of doing your own podcast? She's heard you speak before, and the chats are always very entertaining. I don't know if you've got time for podcasts, frankly.
Well, Catherine, it'd be good fun to do podcasts. I thought of, I'm writing in the Age and Herald every week, sort of journal of the contagion. And at the end, I put some rap nursery rhymes that I've written. And I wouldn't mind doing a podcast of the rap nursery rhyme. But yes, thank you for your vote of confidence. And if I fail at it, I'll get you up from Geelong and you can take over.
Yeah, we'll get you as producer, Catherine. That's what we'll do. Another one, now this is something I'd like to know. What does the writer read, Tom? What do you read?
I read a lot of history, but I read a lot of fiction too. And I'm reading non-fiction at the moment, but most of the time I read fiction. And my favorite writers include Patrick White, Barbara Kingsolver, Toni Morrison, and a lot of poets too. You know, I've read recently a lot of work by Ted Hughes. Now, he is damned because both his wife, Sylvia Plath, and his lover, the lover he had at the time Sylvia suicided, he suicided too. So he's persona non grata in some quarters, but the question is, can he still be a good poet? And the same thing arises when you see an actor who has behaved disgracefully in terms of aggression against women or other men. And that we all know now that crap has to stop. The men have to grow up now. We've had a good run of being adolescents, but it has to stop. It's too damaging. And but say a man like Kevin Spacey, does what he's done make his acting invalid? And does what Dickens did to his wife, sending her away after 10 children, and then publishing a letter that said, "We are criminally unsuited." And she didn't even write back and say, "You should have told me after the second kid, not after the 10th."
After the 10th, exactly.
And, but, you know, we're all such flawed individuals. And sometimes the gods breathe on us and we produce something marvelous beyond our powers and beyond our merits. And
let's look at,
you know, what do you do with that? And I think Dickens was often in that groove. Dickens accessed the gods very easily. Yeah.
Now, Tony Carr says, thank you for all your stories. You've been asked in the past about the chant of Jimmy Blacksmith and that maybe you would not write that book today. Are there topics today that you wouldn't write about?
Well, I tell you what, rightly or wrongly, I wouldn't write from the point of view of an Aboriginal, but not only good manners. There are so many good Aboriginal writers, Ellen Van Neerven, Tony Birch, so on, who are writing from the point of the Aboriginal. And that's why I said that at one stage I would not write the Chant of Jimmy Blacksmith now in the way I did. Purely, I mean, really, if you write about a character, you've got to be right inside there. You've got to, if you're writing about a Muslim character, you have to have read the Quran. You have to have taken on board the worldview. I'm not talking about radical Islam now necessarily, but say someone living in the Western suburbs. If you want to have a truck driver who's a Muslim, who makes friends with an old-fashioned hardcore Aussie family, you can do it, but you have to pay the Muslim character the great compliment of making him more than an aspirational Australian, of making him also who he is, as well as that.
Yeah,
and,
making them real.
And so, yes, and so there are hard things to write about. Recently, there was a novel, I believe, a very good novel about a working class school that met up with a posh school, and everyone went, you know, everyone was given a mentor. Boy and boy were put together. And then there's an affair between a white middle-class boy and a Muslim kid. Now, a publisher wouldn't publish that. They felt it was too close to the bone and, in a sense, too taboo. I just wonder, is that the case? I don't know. These questions, these cultural questions now, are very severe. A lot of them are made up by people who don't write, of course. I think you can write about anything as long as you do it with love of the character. But it's much harder to write about people from other cultures. And then if other people are doing it better than you are, you should just back off.
Bow out. Now,
So,
Joanne Brish wants to know, do you have a handwriting practice? Do you note things down, new ideas, or do you always use the computer?
No, I've only got, well, I've got 3 modes. Sometimes, and this might work with some of the writers who've tuned in this evening, that you can work yourself also out of writer's block by dictating. That's a kinky way to do it. Cheating alongside, go for a walk to your local park, mutter into a dictator. All the lovers in the park will think you're reporting to the council about them. They draw apart. But yes, I do think that there are many ways of writing. Most people write to write, but there's also recording and there's also dictation. My daughter Meg is very good at dictation. She's got a dictation program, and the first draft, the way she drives through the first draft is dictation. And then she's an old journo, of course, and we know what old journos are like. You're a former journo, aren't you?
Yes, I am, and I married a journo who says to me, why would you bother writing more than 250 words? And I always say, why would you stop at 250? They're an interesting
is
breed.
Very difficult to write, you know. If you want to write a complete encapsulation of something in 250 words, much easier to do it in 800 words. Easier still to do it in 15. Better write a book while you're at it.
Yeah, just keep going, just keep going. Now, Kate, I'm not sure what Kate's referring to, but I'm assuming it's to the actual process of writing. Kate's got, is there something holy in it? Do you think that's what it would be, the process of writing?
Something
holy.
W-H-A-L-L-Y?
No, H-O-L-Y, as in holy,
yeah.
as in...
I mean, there's something mysterious in it. Because now, look, my theory about writing is this. The reason so many ordinary people are writers, and it's not based on talent, is that we all have our collective unconscious. This is where all the rituals of our life come from. All the myths, all the gods and goddesses and avatars are in there. All the drowned maidens and heroes, all the stories. Now we inherit that from the Arctic to the Antarctic, so that you find parallels between Aboriginal ritual and Inuit and Yupik, Eskimo ritual in the Arctic. Why is it so? It's because we've all got this collective unconscious, which has a mythic tendency, which has a sense of rites of passage. And a rite of passage always makes a good book. And so we have this wonderful human inheritance, which Jung calls the collective unconscious, that explains why we are the way we are and why we have the same rituals, pole to pole, and why we have the same mythologies, why Gilgamesh rises from the dead and why Christ rises from the dead. And I'm not necessarily dismissing Christ as a myth, except in the nice sense of the word myth, a grand story that nourishes the soul. And so we have all this pole to pole, the same human set of dramas, the whole human set. And this is what we access, the human inheritance, when we begin to write. And that's why the answer to having a problem with writing is to only begin. Because when we begin, we access that universal inheritance that's in all our souls, or all our imaginations, or whatever. Sorry, that saying all our souls was a bit residual RC, wasn't it? Bit tighty, but this is what makes it possible for a yobbo like me to write a halfway good novel. And
halfway good, I think you could go a bit further.
Sometimes when the gods are singing, we write a great novel that's far beyond our powers. This is the mystery of the arts. When we get into the arts, we access this part of our brain. And what comes out is beyond our powers and beyond our dreamings.
Absolutely.
And sometimes it's crap, of course.
Exactly. Sometimes you look and go, "Ooh, gee, what was that about?" Now, Sarah's got a question because we're fast running out of time. Sarah wants to know where you've gathered all your Australian history knowledge from, apart from the collective. Where else have you collected your knowledge of Australian history from?
Well, reading and reading and reading, it began, I was always a considerable reader of Australian history. I'm very interested in the way it has developed in the past. Beginning, well, Manning Clark, I was interested in, also interested in Blaney. He had new lenses to bring. And then many successive historians like, sorry, the name. Yes, indeed. I'm trying to think of my favorite Sydney historian, and I've come up blank in my geriatric way. Grace Karskens. New research into all, and that book of Portia Robinson on the women, she studies 28 convict women who are all condemned as whores. Did they end up as whores? No. And so that women of the First Fleet is an extraordinary study of convict women and the way they negotiated their place in this abnormal society. And there's great writing being done. So I keep up with that. When I researched the Irish convicts for my book, The Great Shame, which was about how the social ills of Ireland generated convicts and generated phenomena in Australia, in the New World as well. That was a great study into the situation of the ordinary hunter convict, including my wife's great-grandfather and great-granny. And then I decided to apply that. I was impressed that the First Fleet was very much a Georgian Enlightenment thing. So after Hughes wrote his valiant and necessary Fatal Shore, I wrote a book called The Commonwealth of Thieves that people seem to like. And it is about the First Fleet being a Commonwealth of Thieves, but also about how it grew out of Georgian England. And so gradually I've put together a history portfolio. Modern times I'm not as good on as the past. So I finished my 3 volumes of history in the Vietnam War. But I feel that, again, our social history is so unexplored. Now, you can't think of anything more fantastical than convictism. We are the only sophisticated society on earth that began not like the Americans with people who are too good for England and for Europe landing at Plymouth Rock and announcing their virtue. We began with pre-fallen Adam and Eve, our European society, and our pre-fallen Adam and Eve, who didn't have a Garden of Eden. They'd already been cast out of the garden by judges in Britain and Ireland. And then that society is running up against the millennial society of the Aborigines. What a story to begin with. And if you just look at the convicts, no other society on earth began as a purpose-designed penal settlement.
No, it's fascinating. And it's Pandora's box, isn't it? You start in one and you just end up going everywhere with it. Tom, we're out of time. And I'm going to finish with this comment. Have I lost it? No, from Catherine. I love this. Tom, you're an Australian treasure. Never stop telling stories. Isn't that the most beautiful way for us to finish?
That is a great wish. And I'm 84 and an end will come. The great thing in No Country for Old Men, the old sheriff says, you know, the best thing about old age, it don't last long. But while I'm here, I'm certainly intending to tell a few more stories. So thank you.
Good. Tom, I'm just so honoured to have the opportunity to interview you, and I'm thoroughly enjoying myself.
Well,
I actually don't want to finish.
down there at your library, and great to meet you again. I have a soft spot for Geelong because I've been carrying a notebook for Geelong. When I went to the place where Dickens died, I had a notebook from Geelong Library and was making notes in a notebook that said Geelong Regional Library.
They are the best notebooks. They are great notebooks.
And I'm a New South Welshman and a rugby league hoon. So what am I doing with?
If you're going to talk rugby league, I'm really, I'm leaving. If you're talking rugby league, I'm leaving. Tom, thank you so much for joining us. If you could all, from your homes, I want you all to clap and thank Tom very much for his time. Thanks,
the
Tom.
Audience.
Again, thank you for your questions. We actually had a couple we didn't get to and some lovely thank yous. So I'm so glad you enjoyed it.
Yes.
And we've got a couple of reminders.
Didn't stop all night sending me questions. So God bless you, Sam.
He was good. Now, if you would like to catch up with this chat again, of course you can. It's been recorded and it will be on the website in a couple of days. Now, the Dickens Boys, please, if you haven't read it, I've got to put it that side because I've still got the questions over my face. Makes for a much easier chat when you can't see yourself, Tom. But the Dickens Boy, it's a marvellous read. It's described as a romp, and it is. There are parts of it that are just hilarious, but oh God, there's some heartbreaking, really moving pieces through it as well. So when they say romp, it is, but there's much, much more to it than that. It's a beautiful book. So grab that and read it. Now, the other thing I'd like to tell you is that many of the bookstores are still trading around Geelong and they are doing online ordering, or I know with the Bookbird, they've got a bike going out around town, so do contact them. And please check out the library's Facebook page. There's next week, the 14th of May, Kathy Lett will be joining us from her home in London to discuss her next book, which is called HRT, which isn't hormone replacement treatment, it's husband replacement therapy. So
yeah, she's a great character.
Oh, she is. That will be a really good one. So once again, on behalf of the library, thank you to everyone for joining us. And most of all, Tom, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Sue. God bless you. May you remain young and radiant. And I don't
know about young or radiant, but I certainly love life. Thank you, Tom. Good night, everybody.
Thank you.